And New Prospect, welcome to RTB 2021 for November the 5th, 2021. Hope you're having a great week so far. And I know many of you are rejoicing that it's Friday, and I am too. So I hope you're having a great day so far today. So our text for today, we have 2 Kings 18. Really a fascinating text in Kings and period of history, in the history of Judah, of the southern kingdom. And then we have Philemon 1. Which we've talked about before. We have Hosea 11, another fascinating text for New Testament purposes as well. And then finally, Psalm 132 through 134. So let me start with the Psalms. So actually, these three Psalms we're looking at today, end up or finish up the Psalms of Ascent that we've been in really since last Sunday. Psalm 120 through 134 are those Psalms of Ascent. Again, these are Psalms that would be sung on the pilgrimage, in the pilgrimage festivals of the Jewish people as they would go up to Jerusalem to worship the Lord as a covenant people of God, joining together in unity. And part of that idea of joining together in unity is actually celebrated in one of our Psalms today in Psalm 133. If you remember, a few weeks ago, I actually preached on Psalm 133, and it's a wonderful little psalm. It's a psalm that celebrates the brothers who dwell in unity. Of course, this idea of Israel being part of a larger family of God and being unified. And of course, in that ancient context, if you remember from my sermon, I talked about how in the ancient context, in family life, you actually lived with your larger family group typically, and so it's a good thing for brothers to dwell in unity. And then the psalmist here describes that unity as being something like oil being poured down on Aaron's beard, and it's a strange little image here, but really what it's talking about is that special oil that was used in anointing of the priests, the high priest even. And talks about, ultimately, I think it's an image used to show that unity among God's people is a sacred thing, that as we live out our lives together in a unified fashion, this is something that shows us to be sacred, that is, to be separated from the world, which is a world that's filled with disunity, and dedicated to God. Only God can do that within a people, right? I mean, we are a people who tend towards disunity. That's just who we are in our sin nature. But when God does something in a people, he can change that. And it's something as this last little metaphor here, the dew of Hermon. If you remember, we talked about that as well. This is, of course, referring to something that is God-given. It was a blessing of God. Dew was something that was celebrated in the ancient world. It was necessary in the ancient world for just even life on a daily basis. We kind of take the dew for granted here, but back then, and in that region, it is something that can even give life, and it was given by God. And so, also is unity. Unity is something that is a God-given thing. So, as Psalm 133, Psalm 132 is a psalm celebrating the king, and some of what we see here in Psalm 132, the remembering, O Lord, on David's behalf, all his affliction, will become very significant in the life of Hezekiah, as we'll talk about here in 2 Kings 18 in just a moment. And then finally, the Psalms of Ascent end with Psalm 134, which is the famous Psalm of the night watchers. Bless the Lord, all his servants who serve by night in the house of the Lord. Lift up your hands. And this is an appropriate psalm, I think, to end those Psalms of Ascent as they would ascend to Jerusalem. Maybe even at night at the end of a long journey, and praise the God who is the one who made heaven and earth. And that phrase, he who made heaven and earth, is pretty recurring type of theme in these Psalms of Ascent. I think we've seen it several times already. That's Psalms. Let's move over to Philemon. So this is another text that we've talked about before. Philemon, if you remember, this is a letter by Paul to a man named Philemon, who was a wealthy man who owned slaves, common practice in the ancient world and the Roman world. And one of his slaves, Onesimus, had run away. It's a serious crime. This was something, obviously, in the ancient world that would be punishable by anything between from burning to maiming, to even death itself. Apparently, Onesimus had fled to Rome, and where Paul was imprisoned, and Paul met him, and Onesimus became a believer, and he decides he needs to return to Philemon to work things out. And this brief letter by Paul urges Philemon to treat his new Christian brother with mercy, and imply that Paul also expects Philemon to grant his freedom in this text. Now, obviously, we've talked about this text before, but I don't know if I remember the last time we talked about it. One of the great, most prominent Old Testament or New Testament scholars today, alive today, and probably the foremost Pauline scholar, most influential Pauline scholar today, I would say, across the board. Many people, even non-Christian biblical scholars, would probably say that as well. This guy named N.T. Wright, and you may have even heard of his name before. He's written book after book on Paul and on Jesus as well. I've got several of these books myself. Even just looking across my office right now, I can see a couple of them. Don't agree with everything he says, especially some of the teachings he has on some of Paul's theology of justification. But at the same time, he's thought-provoking in many ways. And he recently, probably in the last few years, wrote his a kind of a magnum opus on Paul and understanding Paul's theology. And he begins not where we might expect in Romans. We might expect anybody who is talking about a theology of the Apostle Paul to begin with Paul's magnum opus, right, which is the book of Romans, this extensive tome of 16 chapters of theology and application of the gospel. But no, N.T. Wright begins his discussion of Paul's theology with Philemon, because he believed this to be, you could see how the theology had affected Paul in the way he deals with this situation, and the way he interacts with with Philemon here on the behalf of Onesimus. So interesting little book here of Philemon. And I think you do see the gospel working itself out in this one little episode, which seems like a letter that isn't all that significant, but in actuality, it's a significant illustration of Paul's theology. So that's Philemon. Let's move on. We've got Psalms, Philemon. Let's go over to 2 Kings. And 2 Kings 18. We're starting the story in 2 Kings 18. So remember, now Israel is off the scene. The northern kingdom is done. They are taken into exile. But at the same time, we have Hezekiah. So Ahaz was an evil king in Judah. So we're talking about the southern kingdom again. And he is, this is in the third year of Hoshea that Ahaz dies and his son becomes king. By the way, some of the kingly rules, the way at least it's described in the Book of Kings, we have what are called vice regents. In other words, the biblical text will talk about a king being named as king while his father is still alive. And this is something of what even mega churches today do, where they'll name a successor before the pastor resigns, and allow them to kind of have a co-pastorate for a while. Some mega churches have done that before. Well, this is what was happening in Israel. They were naming kings, and the son was kind of acting as a co-regent with the father. And that may be even happening here with Ahaz. But when Hezekiah becomes the sole king, he reigns for a fairly long time, and 29 years, and he, more than any other king that we've seen since David, he is one who, I will pause this just for, sorry about that. Where was I? Get my Bible back over here. So more than any other king since David, this is a king who ruled with righteousness, led Israel to a great reformation, ultimately, a revival of sorts. So you see what he did. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord according to all that his father David had done, and even had surpassed him in many ways. Removed the high places. All the other kings had kept the high places, right? Broke down the sacred pillars, cut down the Asherah, broke down the pieces the bronze serpent that people have been worshiping. That remember that Moses had made this bronze serpent in the wilderness, and now the people have been idolizing it. Now it's gone, and he clung to the Lord. It's an expression of covenant commitment. This Davidic king had clung to the Lord. How? By keeping his commandments that the Lord had commanded Moses. And this has definite benefits because he's going to face the greatest crisis that the Jewish people up until that point in time had ever faced. And that's the Assyrian invasion. And the rest of this chapter tells about that Assyrian invasion. Assyria, of course, had just finished demolishing the northern kingdom in 722 BC, and they set their sights on Judah. This is a little bit later, probably in around 705 BC is when they, maybe even 702 or 3 BC, when they come in and they attack the southern kingdom of Judah. But they surround it, and they have destroyed pretty much every other walled city in Judah up until this point. Destroyed even Lachish, which was the second largest Jewish city at the time. In fact, if you look up Lachish and siege ramp, you can still see a siege ramp going up that the Assyrians built into the city of Lachish. And the Assyrians were using Lachish as kind of their staging ground of their siege of Jerusalem. Hezekiah had built a tunnel, and we still have this tunnel today to bring water into the city. So they were ready for a siege. Jerusalem didn't have a natural water source within the city, so they were ready for this siege. But he knew that he was at the mercy of the Assyrians at this point. And the Assyrians come up to the wall and basically say, "Hey, if you're in the hearing of this, if you want to survive, come out and surrender. Because if you stay in there, you're going to be eating your own filth, and you're going to be driven to starvation, and you're going to end up dying a death that is not one you want to imagine because of the brutality of the Assyrians." Remember what they did? They would impale people. They would tear people limb from limb and skin people alive. I mean, these were a brutal people. So what will Israel do now that they are surrounded by the Assyrians, and all that is pretty much left is the city of Jerusalem? What will this Davidic king, this faithful Davidic king, do? Chapter 19 will tell us. So we'll wait till tomorrow for that. Then finally, we have Hosea 11. Just very quickly on Hosea 11. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I want to direct your attention to two things in this text. Number one, in verse 8. Sometimes people will talk about how God is not a God of great emotion. It is right that God never changes. But God is a God of deep emotions. And we see that here in verse 8. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? And how can I surrender you, O Israel? So even though God has turned to Israel, the northern, and remember, he's still talking about the northern kingdom here, which is still in existence when Hosea is prophesying. Even though God is going to execute his fierce anger against them, he still has compassion on them, and will one day have compassion on his people. Of course, we know this will be through the gospel itself. He says, "My heart is turned over within me, on all my compassions are kindled." So we see something of the heart of God here. So that's one text I want to direct your attention to. But the second is in verse 1. So here it talks about the Exodus event. And it says, when Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. And of course, this is the basis of God's relationship with his people. It's when his relationship with his people first started. It's when he first married his people, you could say, in the Exodus event. And this is going to be the basis ultimately of not just his judging of Israel, but also his restoration of Israel. But this is a verse that is, of course, quoted also in the New Testament, specifically by the book of Matthew, in the book of Matthew. And now, obviously, in this text, in verse 1, it's referring to Israel. Out of Israel, when Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Israel I call my son. Well, who is my son? It's Israel. But in Matthew says that when he says, out of Israel I call my son, he applies this to Jesus. And it's in reference to, by the way, Jesus coming out of Egypt, out of when he and Mary and Joseph had fled down there because Herod was trying to kill Jesus and kill off this future Messiah, or this present Messiah who had just been born. And when Herod dies, Jesus and his family are able to come back. And it says, out of Egypt I called my son. What is Matthew doing there? Is he saying that this was when Hosea wrote this, he wasn't referring to Israel, he was referring to Jesus? No, that's not what he's saying. But I think what he's saying is that Jesus is the new Israel. That's what he's saying. Jesus is the true people of God. And if you want to be part of the people of God, you become part of Jesus. So great little text here that connects with the New Testament. And we see something of the theology of the New Testament through the eyes of this Old Testament prophet Hosea. So I think that's it. We hit Hosea, we hit Philemon, we hit Psalms, and we hit 2 Kings 18. So hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, November 5th. And I hope that little pause in the middle there, I had a student come to my door. I hope hopefully that didn't mess up my recording here.